Mr. President, I rise again to speak about the epidemic of gun violence in the city of Chicago and across America. The American Medical Association has declared gun violence as a public health crisis in America. Every day, almost 300 men, women, and children are shot in this nation. Gun violence touches every American community, but no community has suffered more than the city of Chicago. I'm honored to represent that city. I love it, and I think it's a great city. And I spend a lot of time there to get to know the people who were born there and have lived their lives there and call it home. It is a great honor to call it part of my state that I am honored to represent. But the stories that are coming out of the city of Chicago are heartbreaking stories, and none worse than this week. This week, there was the slaughter of the innocents. In a 4-day period earlier this week, 3 beautiful children under the age of 12 were fatally shot. On Saturday night, 11-year-old Takaya Holmes, sitting in her mom's car, shot in the head and killed. The 19-year-old suspect in custody has been charged. He reported that he was shooting from across the street at rival gang members, and a stray bullet hit Takaya. She died on Tuesday morning. On Saturday, 12-year-old Canary Gentry Bowers shot while playing basketball in the West Englewood neighborhood. She passed away just yesterday. On Tuesday at 1:30 in the afternoon, 2-year-old Levante White shot and killed while sitting in a car with his pregnant aunt and uncle. Levante's uncle was also killed. His aunt was wounded. These shootings are senseless, devastating, and heartbreaking. Already this year, there have been over 400 shootings in Chicago so far this year. That's after there were more than 4,300 shootings last year. My thoughts and prayers, of course, go to the victims and their families. I've attended so many marches and parades, funerals, memorial services. Thoughts and prayers are just not enough. We need to do something to reduce this epidemic of gun violence. There have been too many funerals, too many families who've lost that baby they loved, too many children who suffer the physical and mental trauma of gunshot wounds. Many of these shootings could have been prevented, but it's going to take changes in our laws and changes in our attitude for that to happen. We have absurd loopholes in our gun laws that make it easy for dangerous people to get their hands on guns. We have obvious gaps in our gun background check system. We have inadequate federal laws to stop gun trafficking and straw purchases of guns. These factors allow a flood of illicit guns to come into Chicago from other towns and states, from gun shows in neighboring states where there's no background check. And these drug gangs drive over to these locations and fill up the trunks of their cars with guns to take them and sell them in the neighborhoods to kids who shoot and kill one another day in and day out. We have gun dealers, federally licensed gun dealers, who look the other way when someone comes in to make a straw purchase. That's a purchase of a gun that the purchaser is not going to use, but going to give to somebody who has no legal right to buy a gun. In light of the epidemic of gun violence in our country, Congress should be working around the clock to fix these gaps in our federal law. Instead, look at what we just did yesterday. The Republican-controlled Senate is doing nothing to address gun violence in Chicago or anywhere else. Just yesterday, this Senate on this floor voted to weaken the gun background check system instead of strengthening it. It's hard to understand how the Republican Party can have its priorities so wrong when it comes to gun violence. We can respect Second Amendment rights of individuals. We can respect the rights of people to own a gun for self-defense, for sporting and hunting purposes. I've gone hunting. I've used a firearm, complied with every law in the books, and there were plenty of them. And the hunters who were with me did too. So why is it so hard to ask before we sell a gun to someone whether in fact they have a criminal record, whether they're buying it for another person who might have a criminal record, or whether they have a history of mental instability which would disqualify them from owning a gun. We are facing this crisis in Chicago and across the nation because of this violence. We in Congress have a responsibility to do everything we can at the federal level to protect our neighbors. We can't ignore this responsibility, and we certainly shouldn't be weakening gun laws as the Senate did yesterday. We also need the federal government to be an engaged partner with cities like Chicago to help reduce violence and expand economic options in depressed neighborhoods. You can pick out 3 neighborhoods in the city of Chicago that account for almost 50% of the gun violence. 3 neighborhoods. I visited some of them. Oh, they warn me, don't get out of the car, and they're right. Random gunfire is a reality of life in those neighborhoods. But we know where they are. We know where the shooters live. We know where the victims are. We can do more. President Trump sends out a lot of tweets. He likes to tweet about Chicago, and I'm not quite sure why. Tweeting doesn't save lives. Saying that you're going to send in the feds, well, that may be one of those short tweets that's catchy, but it doesn't mean a damn thing to the people who are being shot and dying in the city of Chicago. Last week, I joined my colleague, Senator Tammy Duckworth, and we sent a letter to the president asking him to do more than tweet when it comes to Chicago. I ask unanimous consent to put this letter in the record.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. We asked the president to put his Twitter account down for a few minutes and instead direct his Department of Justice to enhance programs that improve community policing, like the Cops and Burn Jag grants. We asked him to provide a surge in these programs, just like President Obama did in his first year, through the Recovery Act and the appropriations process. We also asked the president to direct the Justice Department to promote mentoring and job training programs. I want peace on the streets of Chicago and every American city, and I know that one of the keys to this is the belief that there's a chance in this economy for you and your family. We need to have mentoring and job training programs for young people through the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, and for former incarcerated persons through the Federal Second Chance Act. We asked the president to support policing reforms recommended by the Justice Department here in Washington, and we asked him to support our efforts to close the gaps in federal gun laws. There's no denying that poverty plays a role in fueling in fueling violence and in violating justice. And we asked the president also to prioritize funding for jobs programs under the Departments of Labor and Education. These are concrete steps that would help reduce violence in Chicago. So far, President Trump's administration has not committed any additional resources to combating Chicago's violence. Mayor Emanuel was out here just a few days ago to meet with the Department of Justice and make the same plea. The administration instead has threatened to cut funding on top of the devastating funding cuts we've already seen in Illinois under our current governor. Now is not the time for the federal government to abandon its support for the families living in this great city. I urge the president and his administration to reprioritize federal resources to reduce gun violence in Chicago and around the nation. It's going to save a lot more lives than tweeting. If you won't do it for 2 Democratic senators, do it for these families. Do it for the moms and the relatives who are planning now the funeral services of these babies who were gunned down in the city of Chicago this week.